Yes, in the back.
Can you tell us a Reagan joke? Because I know he had an incredible wit.
We've told some already, but there's no, look, there's an inexhaustible supply. I'll tell whatever you do.
It is after his birthday party here, Nancy Reynolds held a birthday party for Reagan here in 1977 when he's turned 66, I guess. 1970, yeah. And he turned 66, and he's talking to the crowd, and he said talking about age, and he said, the definition of middle age is when you're faced with two temptations, and you choose the one to get you home in bed by 9:30.
As President Reagan specialized in these jokes about communism in the Soviet Union, and he had dozens and dozens and dozens of them. One of my favorite ones was there was an argument between an American official and a Soviet official over whose country was more free and democratic. And the American official said, look, we are so democratic, we have so much freedom in America that I can go into the White House and I can go into the Oval Office and I can go up to President Reagan and say, President Reagan, you're doing a lousy job. And the Soviet official said, wait a minute, we can do that. We are certainly the equal of you in that. He said, look, I can go into the Kremlin and I can go into the General Secretary's office and I can say to Mr. Gorbachev, President Reagan's doing a lousy job. Yes, sir.
Early in the session, you used the term populist to describe Reagan's libertarian elevation of the individual above the collective, above the state.
Right.
Over the last 3 years, the term populist has become so ubiquitous, and it's usually been applied in the sense more of people versus the powerful, so the rich, that kind of. You just say a few words on your definition.
And I'm not going to try to do get too Byzantine here, but there are many different strains of populism in America. Reagan was one of his favorite philosophers was Thomas Paine, who was the very flower of the Enlightenment, and that Reagan agreed with Paine and Jefferson that we should have a country where a natural aristocracy, where individuals can rise to the highest level of achievement unencumbered by the hand of nobility or by government. Reagan was suspicious of any concentration of power, and as a matter of fact, often complained about what corporate America did to small business as much as what government did to small business. So he was always suspicious of the concentration of any power whatsoever. But his was a more refined intellectual populism based on Jefferson and based on Thomas Paine.
Yes, sir.
As a good Kansan, I was with Bob Dole in New Hampshire in 1980 and 88 and 96. And also as a good Kansan, I got a basketball game to go catch. But I was wondering about the nonsense with Gerald Ford at the convention and why did he settle on George Bush?
There's a whole chapter devoted on this. It had started out, you have to understand is that Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford really didn't like each other. Ford really didn't like Reagan. And Mrs. Reagan and Mrs. Ford didn't have much use for each other either. Ford was convinced that Reagan's challenge in '76 had weakened him in the fall, although Dick Cheney told me that, as a matter of fact, Reagan was a great sparring partner because he made Ford a much better candidate, and that he wouldn't have come as close to Carter in the fall of '76 had Reagan not challenged him. I think Cheney's right, because Ford was a terrible candidate, he was a terrible campaigner, and not a very good public speaker. But he was forced to get a lot better by the Reagan challenge. So you have these 4 years elapsing from '76 to '80. Ford is waiting to be courted. He wants, to be a prophet of his homeland. He wants the Detroit Convention to throw open its arms to him and say, Mr. President, the nomination is yours. We want you to take on Carter again. He's very miffed because there's a draft movement in the spring of 1980 which goes nowhere. Reagan needs to court Ford. He still needs the moderate Republicans, from Michigan and Pennsylvania and Ohio and other places to win in the fall against Carter. And so what started out as idle gossip and really just kind of a Reagan being polite, because by the time of the Detroit Convention, everybody's talking about this co-presidency. Bill Plant does a story for CBS. It's a George Will wrote a column about it. It's all over the papers. But it's all just, blue sky. But Reagan makes the offer to Ford. And it was done more, I think, initially knowing that Ford was going to turn it down, but it would make Ford, it would flatter Ford so that he would work harder for Reagan in the fall election campaign against Carter. What happens is that the aides get involved, as they usually do, the campaign aides, and they start sitting down and writing down on a document the co-presidency. You have 3 people from the Reagan camp and 3 people from the Ford camp, including Henry Kissinger and Alan Greenspan. And they're divvying up the national government. Carter, Reagan gets this, Ford gets Secretary of State and National Defense, and they are literally divvying up the government, this co-presidency thing. It's now Detroit is aflame in rumors. They're going to make an appearance before the convention. It's a done deal. Brokaw is reporting this, Cronkite is reporting this, Sam Donaldson is reporting this, national press or movie stories. There are the Chicago Tribune and the Wall Street Journal both did early editions saying it's Reagan Ford. Both did early edition newspapers. Reagan's men and Reagan finally come to see that this thing is just ridiculous. I always thought Jim Baker had the best line about the whole thing. He told me, he said, if you had elected the ticket of Reagan and Ford, would you address Ford as Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, or Mr. Vice President, Mr. President? They go into a room at 11:30 that night, just the 2 of them, for 5 minutes. Nobody else, just them. They come out. Reagan tells the fellows that, I can't tell you what we talked about, but I have to tell you is that he doesn't think it's going to work. So what do we do now? And after a long pause, Peter Hanford says, Governor, maybe it's time to call George Bush.